The sun beat down through the canopy of the trees, casting dappled shadows across the dusty path that wound its way through the heart of the Westwood Wildlife Reserve. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming hibiscus, and the distant sounds of chattering monkeys echoed like gossip through the trees. Among the chirping birds and rustling leaves, the main attraction for today's visitors was the primate sanctuary, a massive enclosure mimicking the dense jungles of Central Africa, home to the reserve's crown jewel, a towering silverback gorilla named Kumba. Kumba was both feared and adored by the public. His reputation as a dominant yet unpredictable creature had drawn crowds in the thousands since he'd been rescued from illegal captivity and brought to Westwood 5 years ago. What the tourists didn't know, however, was that Kumba had not been himself lately. He had grown restless, irritable. The zookeepers had noticed his increasing agitation and were quietly discussing behavioral therapy, though none had yet dared to confront him directly. His hulking form could move with terrifying speed, and his raw strength could bend steel bars. Among the crowd gathered at the viewing deck that afternoon was a 16-year-old girl named Mara. She was not like the other visitors. She wasn't there just to take pictures or post videos to social media. She had grown up near the reserve, spending countless weekends sketching animals from the observation decks, while her mother, a primate specialist, worked in the veterinary wing. Mara's connection to the animals was deeper than most could understand. She had watched Kumba grow from a shell-shocked, malnourished creature into the alpha male of his new domain. She knew his moods, his routines, the subtle flick of his fingers that meant agitation, the way his deep-set eyes narrowed when he was sizing up a threat. That day, something about him seemed off. He was pacing more than usual, his massive hands curling into fists every time someone pressed too close to the glass, even though the walls were over 4 inches thick and reinforced. A strange tension was in the air. Mara could feel it humming in her skin. The crowd had begun to swell as the day grew warmer. Families poured in with strollers, backpacks, and sticky-fingered children clutching soft toys. A young woman, distracted, tapping furiously at her phone, set her baby down in a carrier near the railing. She looked up just long enough to wave at someone across the deck and then turned away, leaving the infant momentarily unattended. It only took seconds. A screech from another enclosure startled a group of teens who bumped into the woman. She stumbled, turned just in time to see the carrier begin to wobble near the edge of the platform. The security railing there had a narrow space beneath it, a gap no more than a foot wide, but wide enough. The baby's cries were barely audible over the din, and by the time the mother screamed, it was too late. The carrier tipped, slid, and then dropped off the side, plummeting over 10 feet into the soft underbrush inside Kumba's enclosure. Gasps erupted. Screams followed. The mother collapsed to her knees, wailing. A guard blew his whistle and scrambled for his radio, calling for emergency response. Inside the enclosure, everything seemed to freeze. The baby, miraculously still secure in its carrier, had landed just short of a rocky patch but had started to cry loudly, its tiny limbs flailing. From the far end of the enclosure, Kumba stopped pacing. His dark head turned slowly. He sniffed the air, then moved with deliberate slowness, each step measured and heavy. His gaze locked on the small, squirming bundle. Panic erupted among the onlookers. Some cried for someone to do something. Others pulled out phones, filming. A few backed away from the edge, fearing what might happen. The reserve staff rushed to deploy the tranquilizer team, but the process would take time, too much time. Kumba was already halfway across the enclosure. The gorilla's eyes were unreadable. Was he curious, angry, protective? No one could tell. Mara didn't hesitate. She'd seen enough, sensed enough. Her body moved before her mind could protest. She ducked under the ropes, bypassing the stunned security guard, and sprinted toward the service gate, a small, heavily bolted door that zookeepers used during feeding times. She knew the code, having memorized it from her visits with her mother. Her fingers flew across the keypad. The gate hissed and opened slightly. A klaxon began to wail, alerting staff of a breach, but Mara was already inside. The air within the enclosure was heavier, more humid. The walls of bamboo and foliage seemed to close in on her as she sprinted toward the crying child. The gorilla hadn't noticed her yet. He was only a few feet from the carrier now, his knuckles brushing the dirt, his breathing heavy and deliberate. Mara didn't stop running until she stood between him and the baby, her arms spread wide. "Kumba," she said, her voice firm but calm, as if scolding a child who had wandered too close to danger. "Stop." The massive silverback halted, dust swirled around his feet. His eyes shifted from the carrier to the girl in front of him, his brows furrowed, lips parting to reveal yellowed teeth. He rose to his full height, nearly 7 feet, and beat his chest once, twice. The sound echoed like thunder, but Mara stood her ground. "You remember me," she said softly, stepping closer. "It's me, Mara, you know me." Kumba grunted and his eyes narrowed. For a heartbeat, nothing moved, then he lowered himself to all fours again, cautiously. Mara took a slow step sideways, edging closer to the carrier. Her hands were trembling now. She could see the baby's face, red and scrunched with distress, but otherwise unharmed. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to grab the carrier and run, but she knew sudden movements could provoke a reaction she wouldn't survive. Behind her, alarms blared. A door slammed. She could hear the muffled shouts of the rescue team approaching. She had seconds, maybe less. Kumba shifted again, his attention flickering between the sounds beyond and the girl in front of him. Then he made a low, guttural sound, something close to a sigh, and sat back slightly, his massive weight pressing down into the grass. Mara exhaled sharply. That was as close to a concession as she would get. "Okay," she whispered, inching toward the carrier. "Okay, it's all right." She crouched low, her muscles burning with tension, and reached for the straps. Her fingers fumbled with the buckles, but finally she lifted the baby into her arms, cradling it gently against her chest. The baby whimpered but quieted, as if sensing safety. Kumba watched her, his head tilting slightly. A deep, contemplative noise rumbled in his chest. Then, without warning, he rose and turned away, lumbering back toward the trees. He didn't look back. The gate burst open behind her, and men in tranquilizer gear poured in, shouting her name. She didn't respond. She just kept walking, baby pressed close, until strong arms lifted the infant from her and another pair ushered her out of the enclosure. The crowd outside erupted into cheers, but Mara barely heard them. Her ears rang with adrenaline, her legs buckled, and someone caught her. Later, wrapped in a thermal blanket and sipping sweet tea in the medical wing, she answered the questions calmly, repeating the story again and again. Why did she go in? What had she been thinking? What if Kumba had attacked? She didn't have easy answers. Only that she had known he wouldn't hurt the baby. She had seen something in his eyes, something human, something sad. The baby was unharmed, and the mother, though shaken and guilt-ridden, had thanked her between sobs. Security footage of the incident went viral. Reporters camped outside the reserve. People called her a hero, some even called her reckless. But she didn't care for the spotlight. All she cared about was that Kumba was still in his enclosure, not tranquilized or punished, just left in peace. She visited him the next week, watching from afar as he sat on his favorite perch, quiet and still. Their eyes met for a long moment. He tapped his chest once, then looked away. Mara smiled and whispered, "I remember you too." Days melted into weeks after the incident, but the ripple effect of Mara's bold act didn't fade. Her face was splashed across news outlets, social media feeds, and morning shows, though she turned down every interview. She hated the attention, the way people looked at her with awe or confusion, like she was some mythic figure plucked from legend rather than a teenage girl with dirt still stuck beneath her fingernails and scars on her knees. At school, the whispers followed her down the hallway. "That's her," they murmured, pointing not so subtly. Her teachers started treating her more delicately, too, like she was suddenly fragile or sacred. She missed the anonymity of the weeks before, missed the quiet comfort of disappearing into the background, but most of all, she missed Kumba. The zoo officials had changed the protocols. Access to the enclosures was now strictly monitored, even for staff. Visitor platforms were reinforced. The space beneath the railings had been sealed. A baby-safe zone had been added, along with a new warning system. And Kumba, he had been isolated for observation for over a week after the incident. Mara was told it was standard procedure, nothing punitive, but it didn't sit right with her. She had sensed no aggression in him that day. If anything, he'd shown restraint more noble than many humans would have managed in his place. But logic didn't matter to bureaucracy. She wasn't allowed to visit him directly anymore. Mara's mother, Dr. Elise Tanaka, was a respected primatologist and one of the few voices inside the reserve advocating for Kumba's rights. She pushed for more enrichment, more autonomy in his environment, more recognition of the trauma he had endured in captivity. Elise had been the one to first introduce young Mara to Kumba. They used to spend hours just watching him from a shaded bench, Elise jotting observations in her notebook, Mara sketching the curve of his massive shoulders or the weary droop of his brow. Kumba had never been like the others. Even in play, there was a heaviness in him, like some echo of the chains that had once bound him still clung to his spirit. One evening, long after the visitors had left and the sky had turned the color of rusted copper, Elise found Mara standing at the edge of the restricted zone, arms folded over the railing, just watching the tree line inside the enclosure. The girl didn't turn as her mother approached, but her voice was steady. "He's not okay, Mom. He hasn't been the same since." Elise sighed. She had expected this. "He's eating. He's responding to handlers. That's more than we hoped." "That's not what I meant," Mara said quietly. "He hasn't come to the front once. He just sits in the back and stares at the wall." Elise placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "He trusted me," Mara added, her voice breaking now, "and I made him into a spectacle. You saved a baby's life, Mara. I exposed him." Her mother didn't respond. The wind stirred the leaves, and somewhere a bird called out in a long, descending whistle. The next morning, Mara made a decision. She skipped school, hitching a ride with a delivery truck driver who was heading to the staff gate. She wore her mother's old ID badge and a zipped-up jacket to hide her face. Security was tight, but she had been in the system too long not to know the weak spots. She didn't go to the main gate this time. Instead, she slipped around to the feeding corridor that led to the side of Kumba's enclosure. She had visited there 100 times before, back when she was younger, when Kumba still came to the mesh wall for treats and gentle vocal interactions. She stood now at the mesh door, heart pounding. She whistled softly, the same tune she used to hum when she was 10 and watching him through the glass. Nothing happened for a while. Then a shadow shifted in the trees. He emerged slowly. Kumba moved with that same ponderous grace, as if his body was a fortress and each step was calculated to conserve its weight. His eyes found her almost immediately. He stopped. "Hey," Mara said, "it's just me." He made a low huffing noise, almost a snort, and stepped closer. The mesh door separated them, but she could feel the heat of his breath through the gaps. "I didn't mean for all this," she whispered. "I didn't want them to cage you more." Kumba reached out slowly, one giant hand curling around the metal bars. Mara pressed her hand up against his, her palm dwarfed by his enormous fingers. They stayed like that for a long time, just breathing. She didn't notice the camera until it was too late, a flash. Then another. Mara spun around. A man stood there, phone in hand, smug and sharp in a cheap suit. Local tabloid press by the look of him. "Bingo," he grinned. The girl who talks to gorillas, up close this time. Delete that, she snapped. Oh no, this is gold. Teenage hero reunites with her beastly savior. Come on, people, eat this up. He turned and ran before she could stop him. The story exploded the next day. Photos of Mara's hand against Kumba's filled social media. Some romanticized it, called her the gorilla whisperer or Mowgli in sneakers. Others attacked the zoo for lax security. A few voices, the cruelest ones, demanded that Kumba be moved to another facility entirely, or worse, euthanized. He's too unpredictable, they said. Too dangerous. What if next time it's not a happy ending? Mara watched it all unfold with a sick feeling in her gut. The zoo's board called an emergency meeting. Mara wasn't invited, but she knew the outcome before anyone told her. Kumba would be transferred to a sanctuary in the northern province, one with more isolation, more monitoring, fewer visitors. They called it a temporary reassignment for safety evaluation. But she knew better. He was being removed, silenced. She begged her mother to fight it. I've tried, Elise said, rubbing her eyes. They won't listen to me anymore. They think I'm compromised because of you. Then I'll go public. I'll talk. They'll have to listen if I... No, Elise said sharply. Mara, you've done enough. Not enough, she whispered. Not nearly. That night, Mara made another decision. She called someone she hadn't spoken to in years. Her godfather, Jonas Mercado, a former wildlife operative turned rogue conservationist. Jonas had once smuggled endangered lemurs out of a war zone and relocated orphan chimps by boat in the dead of night. He owed Elise favors. He owed Mara more. This is illegal, he said flatly over the burner phone. He'll die in that place, Jonas. He's already dying inside. I'm not running a rescue mission for a gorilla. I'm not even in the country. You don't have to be. Just tell me what to do. Silence. Then a long sigh. You've got guts, kid. Over the next few days, Mara became a shadow. She memorized the patrol schedules, hacked into the transport logs using a friend's tablet, and pinpointed the exact window when Kumba would be moved. He would be sedated early in the morning, loaded into a containment crate, and shipped out by truck to the airstrip. That was her moment. The night before the transfer, she didn't sleep. Instead, she packed a backpack with essentials, gloves, tranquilizer reversal agent courtesy of her mother's hidden supply, rope, 2 protein bars, and a stolen key card. Then she sat outside Kumba's enclosure and whispered to him through the mesh. Tomorrow, she said. I'm not going to let them take you. He watched her, quiet and still. When the sun rose, so did she. The tranquilizer team arrived at dawn, as predicted. Kumba had been sedated the night before through his food. He didn't resist. He never did. They loaded him into the crate with winches and pulleys. The truck rumbled to life. Mara followed from a distance on her bike, weaving through service roads and side alleys until the truck reached the Old West access gate, the one barely used since the road repairs had started. There, just before the curve near the dry creek bed, the truck stopped briefly to inspect a road hazard sign someone had placed there the night before. That someone was Mara. She used the distraction to climb up the back of the truck and unlock the latch from the inside, slipping inside the container with Kumba. He was groggy but conscious, his eyes fluttering open as she knelt beside him. I got you, she whispered, injecting the reversal serum into his thigh. It was risky. The dose was calculated based on body weight and metabolism data she'd memorized from her mother's notes. Slowly, Kumba's breathing deepened. He stirred, a bang outside. The driver was shouting. They'd noticed something. Mara tapped twice on the floor of the container. Time to move, big guy. Kumba sat up with surprising speed for his size. The container shifted. Panic erupted outside. She opened the side panel. Kumba looked at her, then the gap, then back again. Come on, she said, holding her breath. He leapt. They hit the ground running. Kumba barreled into the trees, and Mara followed. Sirens screamed in the distance. Lights flashed, but they were gone, swallowed by the green. No one knew where they went after that. Some said they were caught days later near the mountains and Kumba was returned quietly under high security. Others claimed Mara and the gorilla made it across the border and vanished into a private reserve run by Jonah's Mercado, where Kumba lived out his days in peace, and Mara became a ghost, a legend. But the truth was harder to trace. Only one photo ever surfaced, blurry, taken by a hiker months later, of a girl walking beside a massive silverback, both silhouetted against the rising sun. In time, the headlines faded. The zoo replaced Kumba's enclosure with an artificial gorilla experience. Featuring holograms and interactive videos, the world moved on, but in a quiet pocket of the forest, far from the noise of humanity, a girl and her gorilla watched the world go by, not as spectacle and beast, but as something older and deeper. Companions, survivors, free. The seasons changed slowly in the high forests of the northern range. Unlike the city below, where people marched through their routines without noticing the sun rising or the trees blooming, here, time unfurled at its own ancient pace. Mornings were cool and soft with fog, and the air always smelled of pine, damp bark, and distant thunder. Somewhere in the folds of that wild, secretive land, Mara and Kumba lived, far from the hum of roads or the questions of officials. It had been nearly a year since they disappeared. In that time, the world had tried and failed to find them, and then, as most things do, it forgot. But Mara remembered everything. They had found shelter in an old research outpost long abandoned by the university team that built it. It was little more than a wooden cabin with a rusted roof and a failing solar panel, but it had clean water, a field nearby for foraging, and enough cover to keep drones and search parties blind. Jonas had kept his promise, arranging for satellite blackouts and signal scramblers through contacts in the conservation underground. Supplies were dropped every few weeks by quiet allies who never asked questions. Mara earned their respect with her silence, her determination, and her deep, intuitive understanding of the animal at her side. Kumba adapted quickly. He had always been intelligent, but outside the walls of the zoo, his instincts began to sharpen in a way even Mara hadn't expected. He learned which berries were safe, how to catch fish from the shallow stream, how to warn off wild boars without bloodshed. He watched birds like a scholar and copied their calls for fun. Some days, Mara would wake to find him perched on the roof of the cabin, gazing out over the tree line as if searching for something in the distance, maybe a memory, or maybe just wondering what lay beyond the ridges. At first, it was survival, pure and simple. Mara had nightmares about search dogs and helicopters, but none came. She didn't know if that meant they'd stopped looking or if Jonas's web of silence had held. She didn't ask. It was better not to know, but over time, something began to shift. Kumba changed. He began building things, nests, shelters, stone circles, not for shelter, but for expression, for joy. Mara started documenting his behaviors again, using her mother's old notebooks. It became their ritual. She would sketch him, study his movements, whisper her thoughts to the wind. He would listen, sometimes respond with a huff or a soft grunt, sometimes reach out and tap her knee with his massive fingers. The bond between them had deepened into something unspoken and profound, not dominance, not ownership, kinship. One morning, she found him holding a wooden carving. A crude figure, shaped from bark and smoothed by river stone. It looked vaguely human. She stared, stunned, and he offered it to her like a gift. Her hands trembled as she took it. That night, she cried harder than she had since the day they escaped. It was not the object that moved her, it was the gesture, the understanding behind it. Kumba wasn't just surviving, he was healing, but healing comes with reckoning. And reckoning came quietly, without warning, in the form of a message slipped into one of the supply crates. The note was brief. Just 3 sentences. They found me. Cameras coming. No more drops. You need to move. Jay, it felt like a stone falling into her chest. Mara reread the note a dozen times. She burned it in the stove, watching the paper curl into ash, then sat on the floor of the cabin with Kumba watching her, his breath steady in the flickering light. She told him everything about Jonas, about the message, about what might be coming. She didn't know if he understood the words, but he understood the tone. When she was done, he rose, walked to the door, and waited. A decision made. They packed only what mattered: her journals, the carved figure, a few essentials. She left behind the rest. The forest had always been temporary. A place to recover, not to disappear into forever. And if the outside world was ready to chase them again, they would not run as fugitives. Not this time. They would walk out as something else entirely. It took them 3 days to reach the edge of the city. They moved at night, avoiding roads and lights, guided by the stars and the faint paths of deer and bear. On the third morning, as the sun broke over the concrete skyline, they stood on a hill overlooking the zoo. Westwood Wildlife Reserve had changed. A giant new building now stood where the primate sanctuary used to be, a digital education center. The old enclosure had been dismantled. Nothing remained of Kumba's former home. Mara stared in silence, her heart knotting in her chest. She had hoped for something, some marker, some memory left intact. But it was gone. Kumba stood beside her, unmoving. After a long while, he let out a low, mournful grunt. They made their way down the hill, not toward the front gates, but toward the staff compound at the far end. The security was tighter, but she had planned this. She had one last favor to call in. She pressed her hand to the intercom and spoke a single word: Elise. It took 15 minutes, but then the door hissed and opened. Her mother stood there, older, thinner, her hair streaked with more silver than Mara remembered, but her eyes were the same, sharp, steady, and swimming with emotion. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Mara said, "He's ready." Elise nodded. "I've been waiting." They brought Kumba through the back gates under cover of night, no fanfare, no announcements. Elise had prepared a temporary sanctuary on the far side of the reserve, miles from the visitors and the press. It was modeled after the forest terrain they had come from, complete with hidden pathways, climbable cliffs, and reinforced freedom zones. It wasn't the wild, but it was something close. Something safe. The reintroduction was slow. Mara stayed with him for days, helping him adjust, watching as he mapped the space with cautious curiosity. His old handlers were brought in under strict supervision, but most of them simply watched from afar, humbled by what they saw. Kumba didn't rage. He didn't retreat. He explored. He accepted. After a week, Mara made her choice. She stood at the edge of his new domain, watching him from a wooden platform tucked behind the trees. He sat by the water's edge, carving again with a stick, occasionally glancing up to check if she was still there. "I can't stay," she said aloud, not expecting him to hear, but needing to say it. "You're safe now. It's your story now." She left the carved figure in the dirt near the fence, her gift returned. A memory kept, then she walked away. 6 months passed. Mara's reappearance became global news. She gave one interview, just one on her terms. No cameras, just her voice. She spoke not of heroism, but of choice, of understanding, of the right every creature has to their own story. She said nothing about how they had lived, only that they had survived. When asked what she hoped would happen next, she said, "I hope we learn to listen before it's too late." She returned to school. She wrote papers. Eventually, she got accepted into a university program for environmental ethics and animal cognition. People tried to name scholarships after her. She declined. She didn't want to be a symbol, but once a month she returned. She went to the private edge of the sanctuary where the forest met the reserve. She sat in silence. Sometimes he came, sometimes he didn't. That was the agreement. One spring afternoon, she found something waiting for her on the bench, another carving. 2 figures this time, one large, one small, side by side. She pressed her fingers to the wood and smiled. In the end, the story wasn't about a girl saving a baby from a gorilla. It was about what came after. About how the world expected danger but found grace. how a wild heart and a young soul found each other in the chaos and together chose not just freedom, but peace.